It started like any other Saturday. Sun blazing overhead, shopping bags rustling against plastic carts, and the hum of families going about their errands in the parking lot of the Jackson Supercenter. But what happened next would unravel everything. People thought they understood about safety, identity, and the quiet power of presence. "Put your hands up." The voice cut through the humid afternoon air like a gunshot. I said, "Put your hands up." It wasn't just loud. It was loaded with tension, accusation, and something far more dangerous: assumption. Brandon Lewis stood frozen beside his silver sedan, one hand resting on the trunk, the other still clutching a bag of groceries. Apples, milk, bread, ordinary things. And now, a gun aimed at his chest. Across the lot, a young white officer stood behind the open door of his patrol car, arms extended, his weapon trained directly at Brandon. His face was flushed, his stance jittery, like a man who had already decided he was in danger and had to prove it. Brandon didn't move. Not because he was afraid. Not yet. But because in that split second, he understood something vital. This wasn't about law. This was about fear. His fear. The officer's fear. And the fragile space between them. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Brandon said calmly. His voice was measured, practiced. He had used it to calm hostage takers, to brief federal cases, to train rookies fresh out of Quantico. But now, it was being used in a grocery store parking lot. "I didn't do anything wrong." "Don't move," the officer snapped, stepping closer, gun still raised. "I saw what you were doing. Step away from the vehicle." Brandon did as instructed, slowly lifting both hands into the air, his heart pounding but his face controlled, his FBI training kicking in like muscle memory. The worst mistakes in confrontations like this came from instinct, too fast, too sharp. So he moved deliberately, every gesture intentional, every breath monitored. His name was Brandon Lewis. He had worked counterterrorism, taken down cartels, and briefed high-level task forces. But right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he was a black man in a nice car, wearing a jacket and jeans, and that apparently made him suspicious. The Cano officer's name tag read Morton. He couldn't have been older than 25. His voice trembled. His eyes darted, not just watching Brandon, but scanning for something he couldn't articulate, something he expected to go wrong. "You looked suspicious," Morton barked. "You..." Kept looking around. "What were you hiding?" Brandon blinked, stunned. "I was loading groceries." "You match a report," Morton said vaguely. No description. No clarity. Just accusation wrapped in authority. Brandon's tone didn't change. "You didn't identify yourself before drawing your weapon." Morton's voice grew louder. "Don't get smart with me." A few people had started watching. A mother pulled her child back toward her car. A man paused mid-step, phone now recording quietly by his thigh. Brandon kept his hands up, but inside something burned. He had faced men with bombs, men with rifles. But being targeted for existing, for walking, shopping, breathing, cut deeper than any bullet ever could. He took a breath. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," he said. Morton's response came like venom. "What? You think you're special? You think I won't take you down right here if I have to?" That was it. The line crossed. The spark ignited. Brandon didn't flinch, didn't fold. He stared straight into Morton's eyes and spoke with the weight of 2 decades in federal law enforcement. "No, I think you're about to make a mistake you can't take back." And that's when everything changed. Before a gun was ever drawn, before cell phones started recording, before a grocery run turned into a moment that would challenge an entire department's soul, Brandon Lewis was already built for storms like this. Not by chance, not by badge, but by fire. He was born on the south side of Jackson, Mississippi, in a 2-bedroom house that never had central air but was filled with discipline, laughter, and the kind of hard-earned respect that doesn't show up on paper. His mother, Gloria, worked double shifts at the community health clinic. She was the kind of woman who didn't believe in shortcuts or sugarcoating. Her hands were always moving, bandaging wounds at work, folding laundry at home, or gripping Brandon's shoulders gently whenever she sensed the world had hit him too hard, too young. His father, Lionel, was a long-haul trucker, quiet, towering, barely home. But when he was, his presence said enough. He taught Brandon how to fix a tire, how to split kindling, how to answer disrespect with silence. "Every word you give away you can't take back," he'd say. "But your actions, they speak louder anyway." That stuck. Life wasn't easy, but it was real. There were nights when gunshots crackled a few blocks over and mornings when Brandon had to walk past broken glass to get to school. But he kept his head down. He didn't chase trouble, and when it chased him, he outran it, with books. While some kids talked about rims and rap battles, Brandon was sneaking into the library before it opened, reading about justice systems, courtrooms, and cases that had changed the world. His sixth-grade teacher, Mrs. Edmonds, saw something in him, something sharp but unfinished. She'd keep him after class, let him borrow books others weren't allowed to check out, and once told him, "You don't just read for answers, Brandon. You read like you've got something to prove." Maybe she was right. By high school, he'd earned a reputation, honor roll, quiet leader, never one for hallway drama. He never raised his voice, but people listened when he spoke. That calm wasn't weakness, it was his shield. He knew better than most that a single outburst could follow a young black man further than any GPA ever could. He earned a scholarship to study criminal justice upstate. And while most kids from his zip code didn't make it past sophomore year, Brandon graduated early, dean's list, letters of recommendation, and a quiet determination in his step. The day he got the acceptance letter from the FBI Academy, he didn't tell anyone except his mom and dad. His mother wept softly. His father nodded once and muttered, "Just don't let that badge change who you are." And he didn't. His career spanned over 2 decades, starting with narcotics in Detroit, then organized crime in Houston, and eventually counterterrorism in Atlanta. He saw things most people wouldn't believe: drug dens disguised as daycare centers, street kings who moved money cleaner than Wall Street brokers. He led raids, interrogated cartel leaders, once spent 46 hours negotiating during a hostage standoff, where even the negotiator tapped out, but Brandon didn't. He never chased headlines, never showed off his badge like a weapon. He believed in letting his actions do the talking. His colleagues respected him, his enemies feared him, and the Bureau trusted him. But all those years in chaos taught him something he never read in any textbook. Real power isn't how loud you are. It's how steady you can stay when the world gets loud around you. Still, despite the chaos and success, there was one thing that pulled at him harder than duty: home. When the Jackson field office offered him a transfer 5 years ago, he didn't hesitate. His parents were aging. His children, 2 teenagers, were growing too fast. He wanted them to walk the same sidewalks he had, know their roots, and understand that strength doesn't come from power. It comes from restraint, from knowing who you are and never letting the world shake that loose. He returned to Jackson not as the same boy who left, but as a man molded by fire and framed by clarity. And in Jackson, there was one more reason the move felt right. Dan Carter, Dan and Brandon, had grown up a few streets apart. They'd shared bikes, got benched together on their middle school basketball team, and once snuck into the school gym after hours to practice free throws under flickering lights. While Brandon left for college and federal service, Dan stayed. He joined the police force, climbed the ranks brick by brick, and earned respect in his own right, not just because of the badge, but because of how he carried it. Their paths diverged, but never broke. They stayed in touch: birthdays, funeral calls, occasional Sunday dinners. There was trust there, real trust. So when Brandon stood in that parking lot, with a gun pointed at him, heart pounding, groceries at his feet, he already knew who to call. Not to pull rank, not to demand vengeance, but because if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. And now here he was, standing completely still, arms raised, face calm, while a nervous, red-faced officer shook behind a gun he wasn't trained to control. The badge in Brandon's back pocket hadn't been shown yet, but what it stood for, the decades of integrity, training, discipline, it burned brighter than any ID ever could. He wasn't scared, but he was tired. Tired of being misread. Tired of playing defense for simply existing. Tired of proving what should have been obvious. The badge in his pocket might protect him for a moment, but the truth was, that shouldn't be what saves a man in America. And in that moment, in that still parking lot filled with whispers, phones, and judgment, Brandon Lewis stood like a storm in slow motion. Not because he wanted to be a symbol, but because, once again, he had no choice. The silence between them cracked like glass under pressure. Brandon stood still, his hands aching from being held high for so long. Officer Morton hadn't moved either, except for the gun in his trembling hand, which now dipped slightly toward the ground, no longer aimed directly at Brandon's chest, but still threatening, still reckless. Brandon knew the moment had arrived. He spoke slowly, clearly, his voice unwavering. "I'm reaching into my back pocket. 2 fingers only. No sudden movements. You want ID? I'll show it to you, but you better be ready." Morton didn't respond, not with words, but his grip loosened just enough. Brandon moved with practiced precision, never breaking eye contact, never giving this rookie any excuse to claim fear. 2 fingers, nothing more. He pulled out his wallet, flipped it open with a flick of his thumb, and held it out, chest level, deliberate. Inside, the unmistakable gold badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The wind rustled a plastic grocery bag still clinging to the cart. Somewhere behind them, a teenager whispered, "He's FBI." Like it was a plot twist in a movie he hadn't seen coming. Morton blinked hard. His mouth opened, but the words caught in his throat. His entire posture began to unravel, the rigid stance of control replaced by something closer to dread. He glanced at the badge again, then at Brandon's calm, unwavering expression, and then toward the growing crowd gathering at a safe but observant distance. Brandon didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even drop his hands yet. "I told you," he said evenly. "You're pointing a gun at a federal agent, in public, with no cause. Now call your supervisor." Morton swallowed hard. His hands now visibly shook, the weapon hanging like dead weight. He was unraveling, and everyone could see it. Phones were out, cameras recording. A mother stood by her minivan holding her daughter close. A man in a baseball cap muttered, "That kid's cooked," to no one in particular. It was all happening in real time, and Brandon knew that even though he had survived the first few minutes, this moment could still go sideways in a heartbeat. He tucked the badge slowly back into his wallet and into his pocket, never taking his eyes off Morton. "I'm going to make a call now," he said, voice quiet but firm. "Don't stop me, don't touch me, you've already done enough." Morton didn't move. Maybe he couldn't. Brandon reached for his phone, tapped the screen, and scrolled. With purpose. His thumb hovered over a single name, Dan Carter. He pressed the call button and put it on speaker. 1 ring, 2, then a voice. "Carter." Brandon didn't hesitate. "Dan, it's Brandon. I need you at the Jackson Supercenter right now." There was a pause, brief but heavy. "What's going on?" Brandon's tone dropped low, controlled, tight. "One of your officers pulled a gun on me. No warning, no cause. It's bad, Dan, real bad." Another pause. Longer this time. Then Dan's voice, deeper now. Serious. "You okay?" "I haven't been touched," Brandon replied. "But this is a problem." "I'm on my way," Dan said immediately. "Don't move. 5 minutes." The call ended. Brandon looked at Morton and spoke quietly. "He's coming, and you're going to have to explain every second of this." Morton looked like he wanted to disappear. He took a step back, still holding the gun, though it now dangled uselessly at his side. His eyes darted around, at the crowd, the store entrance, his patrol car, searching for an escape that didn't exist. And then the arrival. A black unmarked SUV pulled into the parking lot, fast but quiet. No sirens, no lights. But everyone could feel the shift in atmosphere. This wasn't backup. This was command. The door opened. Out stepped Chief Daniel Carter, tall, broad-shouldered, salt-and-pepper hair, and a crease between his brows that had deepened over the years. He wore a button-down and slacks, no badge visible, but his presence, his stride made it clear this man runs the room. Dan's eyes locked onto Brandon first. A flicker of recognition, worry, guilt. Then they snapped sharply to Morton. "Morton," he barked. "Holster your weapon. Now." Morton obeyed instantly. No argument. His fingers fumbled as he resecured the firearm. He didn't dare make eye contact with his chief. Dan stepped closer to Brandon. "Are you okay?" Brandon nodded once. "Physically?" "Yes, but you and I both know this never should have happened." Dan's jaw tightened. He turned back to Morton. "Walk me through it. What exactly did you think you were doing?" Morton opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "I'm waiting," Dan said, his voice edged in steel. Morton stammered. I thought he was acting suspicious. He didn't respond when I called. I thought maybe he was trying to break into a car or something." Dan's eyes narrowed. "Did you receive a report? A description? Anything at all?" "No, sir. I was just doing patrol. I saw him moving around." "Moving around?" Dan scoffed. "You mean loading groceries into his car?" Morton's face flushed, his jaw clenched. But he didn't respond. "And then what?" Dan asked. "You drew your weapon without cause, without IDing yourself, without protocol." "I didn't know who he was," Morton offered weakly. "And that's exactly why you follow protocol," Dan snapped. "You don't pull a gun on a man just for existing. You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic human respect." Morton looked like a kid caught cheating on a final exam. The bravado was gone. All that was left was shame, and the awareness that everyone was watching. Dan turned to the crowd, his voice loud but composed. "Folks, I apologize for what you just witnessed. This will be handled properly." Then, without fanfare or hesitation, he turned back to Morton. "Badge, gun, radio. Now." Morton froze. "Do it." His hands moved slowly. He unclipped his badge, placed it into Dan's outstretched palm. Next, his sidearm. Finally, the radio clipped to his belt. Each item surrendered like a piece of armor, being peeled off a man no longer fit to wear it. "You're suspended," Dan said, his voice low but final. "Report to my office after this. You'll be escorted back. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Morton mumbled. Dan waved to a nearby officer who had just pulled in. "Escort him, and don't let him speak to anyone until I've talked to him myself." Morton didn't say another word. He walked stiffly toward the patrol car, got in the back seat, and closed the door behind him like it weighed 100 pounds. The crowd was quiet now. Phone still recording, but no one speaking. No applause. Just the sound of consequence echoing across the asphalt. Dan turned back to Brandon. "I'm sorry. You shouldn't have had to go through that, especially not here." Brandon's eyes scanned the crowd. Then he said it. The words that didn't need a badge behind them, just truth. "If I hadn't had that ID, we both know how this could have ended." Dan nodded slowly. "You're right. And that scares the hell out of me." Brandon looked back toward the patrol car where Morton sat, hollow and pale. Then back at the quiet crowd, watching, recording, remembering. He spoke one last time, not to Dan, not to Morton, but to everyone. "You didn't know who I was. And that's the problem. Because it shouldn't matter." The headlines faded, but the weight of that day lingered like a bruise beneath the skin of the Jackson Police Department. What happened in the parking lot had gone viral within hours. Clips circulated, voices debated, outrage erupted. But Brandon, Lewis wasn't interested in noise. He wanted something quieter, deeper, accountability. Chief Dan Carter moved quickly. The very next morning, before the news cycle could twist the facts or bury the truth, he sat across from the head of Internal Affairs with a formal request in hand. No vague directive. No hollow statement. He asked for a full, urgent investigation into Officer Kyle Morton's conduct. No delays. No excuses, Dan said. We owe this to more than just Brandon. We owe it to the badge. Internal Affairs didn't wait. They dove in head first. The first thing they pulled, surveillance footage from the Jackson Supercenter parking lot. Multiple angles, high resolution, crystal clear. One camera showed Brandon walking to his vehicle with a shopping cart, groceries visible. No erratic movement. No confrontation, just a man on his day off. Another angle captured Morton's arrival, his cruiser swerving into a spot, him jumping out without hesitation, no verbal warning, gun already in hand. No audio, but the body language was loud enough. He never identified himself, never paused, just assumption, urgency, and an unearned sense of danger. Then came the witnesses. A teenage skateboarder submitted a full video he'd captured from behind a nearby tree. The footage confirmed what Brandon had said all along. He never raised his voice, never reached for anything, never moved aggressively. Just calm, controlled, surreal. Several other shoppers submitted statements. A retired teacher described Brandon as someone's dad, just doing errands. A mother who had rushed her daughter away said, "That officer, he just started yelling." It didn't feel right. Some admitted they had been too afraid to intervene. But none of them described Brandon as suspicious. Not one. Then it was Brandon's turn to speak. He didn't appear in person. He didn't need to. His written statement was enough to silence a room full of hardened investigators. Being held at gunpoint in broad daylight while doing nothing but shopping for my family was one of the most humiliating moments of my life. It had nothing to do with my actions. It had everything to do with my appearance. If I hadn't had the experience, training, and restraint that I do, this could have ended in tragedy. The words didn't shout. They didn't accuse. But they landed like stone on glass. The facts aligned. Footage, testimony, and Brandon's unwavering composure. Morton was the last to be interviewed. He showed up to Internal Affairs wearing a wrinkled navy suit that looked borrowed and an expression that flickered between guilt and fear. His lawyer sat beside him but couldn't shield him from what he knew was coming. When asked to explain, Morton's words stumbled out like a confession wrapped in confusion. "I was scared," he said. "I didn't know who he was. I thought he was acting strange. He wasn't responding. I thought maybe he was trying to break into a car. I made a bad call. I didn't mean to profile him." But the evidence told a different story. Brandon hadn't moved until commanded. The footage clearly showed Morton escalating before any perceived threat. The lead investigator leaned back, stone-faced. "You said you were scared. What exactly were you scared of?" Morton looked down. I don't know. It just felt wrong, like something was off. No mention of crime, no specifics, just a feeling. And a man with a gun acting on it. The preliminary report was completed within 48 hours. Violations: unprofessional conduct, abuse of authority, use of unnecessary force, failure to follow protocol, evidence of racial bias in language and behavior. The findings were clear. Officer Kyle Morton had acted recklessly, unjustifiably, and with deeply flawed judgment. 3 days later, a disciplinary hearing was convened. Closed doors. Long table. Heavy air. At one end sat Chief Dan Carter. Next to him, the Internal Affairs lead and 2 senior officers, each with more than 25 years of experience. None were strangers to tough decisions. But this one felt heavier. Because this wasn't just about Morton, it was about trust, and whether a badge could still mean what it was supposed to mean. Morton sat at the opposite end. Slouched, silent. His attorney did most of the speaking. They asked the board to consider his youth, his inexperience, his clean record until now. This wasn't hatred, the attorney argued. It was fear, misjudgment, a one-time mistake. Then Morton spoke, his voice barely held together. "I regret what happened. I didn't know who he was. I wasn't trying to hurt him. I thought I saw something wrong." Dan Carter didn't blink. When he finally stood, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This wasn't just a mistake," he said. "This was about judgment, bias, power. You weren't threatened, Kyle. You were uncomfortable. And instead of asking questions, instead of following protocol, you reached for your weapon. That's not how we serve. That's how people die." He turned to the board. "We owe our community more than training manuals. We owe them accountability. If we excuse this, we send a message that fear is a valid reason to draw a gun on someone doing nothing wrong. And that message, it kills." The board went into deliberation. 15 minutes later, they returned. Chief Carter spoke the final words. "Officer Kyle Morton, the board finds your actions to be a severe violation of department policy and conduct, effective immediately. You are terminated from the Jackson Police Department." Morton didn't speak. His attorney gently placed a hand on his shoulder, but nothing could undo what had already been carved into record. There was no applause, no vindication, just silence. Outside the precinct, the sun still burned across the streets of Jackson. But inside that conference room, the system, for once, had done what it was supposed to do. Brandon Lewis wasn't there to hear the verdict, but he didn't need to be. Because for men like him, justice isn't about spectacle. It's about truth finally standing taller than fear, even if only for a moment. The evening came in slow, gentle waves. Crickets hummed beneath the fading Mississippi sun, and the porch of Brandon Lewis's home felt like the last quiet place on earth. He sat there alone, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand, the ice clinking softly every time he lifted it to his lips. His phone rested in his lap, screen glowing with unread messages, more than he could count, more than he could truly process. Some were from old colleagues. "Saw what happened. Proud of you." Others, from strangers. "You handled that like a real one." A few were painful. Gut punches in short sentences. "I'm just a teacher. What would have happened to me? My son's only 17. He looks like you. That could have been him. Thank you for standing still. For all of us who can't." Brandon read each one slowly, not with ego, but with weight. This wasn't just a story anymore, not just a viral clip. It was a mirror, and people saw themselves in him, in his silence, in his restraint, in the terrifying knowledge that without the right badge, that day could have ended in a very different headline. But he didn't feel angry. Not now. The rage had passed. In its place, something harder to carry. Responsibility. He hadn't asked. To be a symbol. He hadn't wanted this spotlight. That morning, all he wanted was to pick up groceries and get back to his wife before the heat made the milk turn. But that's how injustice works. It doesn't give notice. It doesn't check. For your credentials, it just shows up and demands to be seen. His phone buzzed again. A name lit up. Dan Carter. Brandon answered, voice quiet. "Yeah?" Dan didn't waste time. "It's done." Brandon closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again. "Thank you." "I meant what I said," Dan replied. "This isn't over. We're auditing all our training programs, body cam policy, community sessions, everything. I won't let someone else carry that badge if they don't know what it means." Brandon let the words settle between them. "That's a start." Dan exhaled. "I'll talk to you soon." The call ended. Brandon leaned back in his chair, let his eyes wander across the neighborhood. His neighborhood. Same cracked sidewalks. Same oak tree with the bent branch. Same porch light that his dad once replaced by hand. But something had shifted. He thought of Morton, not just as a failed officer, but as a product of something deeper, something broken long before that gun was ever drawn. And he thought of the next young black man who might stand in that same parking lot. No badge. No call to a friend in command. Just the same skin, the same quiet dignity, and the same risk. And that's when Brandon whispered it aloud. Not for the cameras, not for the crowd, just for himself. Justice doesn't end with a firing. It starts when things change. He sipped the last of his tea, the ice nearly melted. But Brandon's story isn't over. The next chapter? It begins when someone else steps into that same lot. Without the badge, without the protection, without the privilege of a name like Brandon Lewis. Will the system still recognize the humanity in them? Stay tuned. The next chapter will challenge everything you thought you knew about authority, identity, and what it truly means to protect and serve. Subscribe, share, and never stay silent when it matters most.